Hello, everybody. Good afternoon to all of you joining us online from via Zoom or on YouTube, perhaps. We are joined here by 8 excellent speakers in this webinar on the semiconductor industry. My name is Maaike Okano-Heijmans. I'm affiliated to the Clingendael Institute here in The Hague. Where it's a beautiful sunny day. So we're very grateful for everybody who's spending his afternoon, or at least this part of the afternoon with us. And of course, it's no coincidence that we're doing this webinar from the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is one of not too many players in the semiconductor value chain, home to several big players in the industry. One of them we have with us here today, Joost van de Hees of the Dutch company ASML, that I'm sure needs no introduction. And of course, ASML is one of several. We also have NXP, we have ASM in the Netherlands. And then, of course, there's also, well, from Germany, Annalena Riem, who is joining us from Infineon, another key player in the industry. We will give them the floor in just a minute to give them their private sector perspectives on what is happening. Of course, as we all know, this security security concerns are taking over also in in the semiconductor field. The race for development of supremacy in the technological field is going on at the same time. So the question is, how do European governments and European private sector deal with this squeeze? To introduce our debate today, we have Heleen Bakker. And in between Heleen and our 2 private sector representatives, we will have John Lee of the Merix Institute in Berlin. We have Mathieu Duchatel of Institut Montagne, and we have for you also my colleague Brigitte Dekker of the Clingendael Institute. So I think this should be a very informative session where you will hear expert views as well as practitioners' views. Heleen, first of all, over to you. You're the director, of course, today at the Ministry of Economic Affairs, Director for European and International Affairs there, where you focus on many important issues, the digital transition, climate, strategic autonomy, industrial strategy, all very hot potato topics. That you are actually leading as a sort of an outsider, because you are officially, of course, or originally affiliated with the MFA, now commissioned to the Ministry of Economic Affairs, previously posted in Washington. So we thought you would be the excellent person to introduce this topic to us from a Dutch perspective. So can I give you the floor?
Yes, well, thank you, Maaike, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you all this afternoon. I look forward to a very interesting webinar on a very topical issue, as you said, the fate of the semiconductor industry against the backdrop of a quest for technological domination, where we find the US and China at loggerheads, and the use of geo-economic instruments at the core of economic policy in a new geopolitical reality. It's certainly no secret that China has set ambitious goals. Its latest 5-year plan speaks clearly about its desire to become a technological powerhouse. And self-reliance in technology has long been indeed a national strategic pillar for Beijing. And self-reliance in chips is central to that goal, with chips as the building blocks for innovations, from artificial intelligence to networks to autonomous vehicles, etc., you name it. The United States, at the same time, is equally determined not to lose out. In the late days of the Trump administration, we saw the White House present a plan to protect and promote a number of critical and emerging technologies, listing 20 of them, including semiconductors and microelectronics. The Biden administration has placed technology at the heart of the National Security Council, adopting a whole-of-government approach. And a wide array of instruments is at the administration's disposal. On the protect side, first of all, where the US is looking to assert control over ecosystems and value chain by diminishing or maybe even altogether eliminating dependencies on its adversary China. And at the same time, reaching out to trusted partners where these partners can deliver an added value or mutual interests. And the US, of course, we know also has more coercive measures at its disposal, as we have also witnessed in the past with the use of entity lists, for example. But like China and also Europe, the US also looks at the promote side, including investments in research and development to spur innovation. And in addition, alliances and partnerships should help build this trusted community, this trusted ecosystem. Congress, meanwhile, is also keen to get a handle on technological advance with several legislative initiatives underway. And the semiconductor industry is high on the list of priorities. The anxiety has only grown, as you all are all aware, as during the COVID pandemic, a shortage of chips has impacted industry, in particular the automotive industry, for example. And as these shortages are felt, the awareness of vulnerabilities and dependencies also increase. And it's fair to say that there is now a clear desire to do something about it. And then the question is, where does this leave Europe? Where does this leave the Netherlands? Where does this leave our industry? And this, of course, will be the topic of today's webinar. And I'm certainly looking forward to what experts and industry have to offer on these questions. From a government perspective, I would like to make a few observations and share the following. I should start by pointing out that the Netherlands is not blind to the changed landscape. We see an increase in state-led investments. We see how there is economic espionage. We see how the risk that vital processes are undermined has increased over time, and we find ourselves now more vulnerable to disruptions by digital means. And as a result and a reaction, we can also see the attempt at decoupling in high-tech value chains. And these developments certainly also impact Dutch interests from a national security perspective, but also from a perspective of competitiveness. And these two interests are intertwined and require a government response. And the Dutch government does respond. We do so in a balanced way, relying on a broad toolkit that contains both offensive and defensive elements. When national security is at stake, our approach needs to reflect those both angles. This is why on the protect side of things, we are working to enhance our investment screening. For example, legislation there is in the works. And this is also where our export control system comes into play. We will not compromise on national security. But in addition, and this is taking more of a forefront these days, we also need to focus on boosting our competitiveness in a more offensive way. Because in order to protect, we must promote, otherwise there is nothing left to protect. And here we need to get the basics right. That means a level playing field, an assertive trade policy, a strong competition framework. These are all things that we need to work on at the European level. And the Netherlands in this regard is a very active EU member state, I should add. On top of that, we look at specific value chains, seeing if and where we detect dependencies that we regard as undesirable. And for the Netherlands, this is a fairly new approach. We've always been dependent on foreign trade and investment for our economic well-being, which explains our focus on an open economy, our international orientation. But we cannot rely on everyone to follow and play by the same rule book that we have painstakingly developed internationally. We need to react to abuse and protect our own interests. And this is why also at the European level, open strategic autonomy has been added to the toolbox as a potential response in order to secure a resilient economy in which the EU and its member states are able to make their own choices and safeguard public interests at all times. So I want to emphasize here that open strategic autonomy is not an objective per se, something we should under all circumstances strive for, but it should be seen as a means to an end. And the ultimate objective then is to be able to safeguard public interests on our own account, using our own strategic agency at the global stage. It's good to emphasize that preserving this open economy is our default and that we do not see protectionist measures as a viable economic instrument, because protectionism ultimately raises the price for all parties, especially consumers. And complete decoupling is not an option either, with interdependencies in value chains. It's not the way to go. But we should also not be taken for a ride. So in certain instances, especially when the protection of public interest is at stake, we do need to respond to threats accordingly. And an approach that encourages more strategic autonomy or self-sufficiency may be worthwhile in these instances. The Netherlands supports the ecosystem orientation of the European Commission, and we are in favor of industrial alliances between European industry. I'm sure we'll hear more about that this afternoon as well. In certain instances where market failure is clearly evident and there is a long-term strategic framework in place, also these so-called IPSAI, the important projects of common European interest, can be helpful. The Netherlands considers participating in these IPSAI under certain conditions. And for the semiconductor industry, I'm happy to announce that this week our government has indeed called for expressions of interest for the IPSAI on microelectronics. So this is the stage where Dutch companies can now submit their projects abstracts to see if participation will be worthwhile and what is at stake for the industry, and also what are their wishes in this regard. Next week, the Commission is set to publish its updated industrial policy, and we can expect a mix of these instruments that I just mentioned to be included. So we're quite looking forward to that. The week after, we expect the Commission to introduce the level playing field instrument. And we have seen in the recent past the publication of proposals such as the Trade Policy Review, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and last month a big overarching communication on the digital decade. And in this last communication, the Commission proposes that by 2030, the production of cutting-edge and sustainable semiconductors, including processors in Europe, is at least 20% of world production in value. So it's quite an ambitious goal. The Dutch government's appreciation of this communication will be sent to Parliament shortly. Maaike, I stop here. I hope to have indicated that the Dutch government's response is a mix of defensive and offensive strategies and instruments, often originating at the European level. And I'm curious to find out if today's participants feel that this is indeed an effective approach and if it reaches far enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heleen. That was an excellent scene setter. Promote and protect are indeed the two keywords I think that we hear oftentimes when speaking to Dutch officials. And it might seem as if this is well, only natural, no change from before. But for everybody who knows, of course, the Dutch hesitation to go with industrial policy defensive tools, I think well, you have to be aware that this is quite a change. That now it's competitiveness, but also national security considerations indeed. So thank you for clarifying that, also for mentioning open strategic autonomy, the ecosystem orientation. I'm sure that we will hear more about these issues from the other speakers also. And I know that you will be staying with us and that you're also well open to answer questions later on. So I should call on everybody who's in this call, of course, to start posting your questions, including to Heleen. And to other speakers also, as they speak, feel free to already, well, put in your thoughts in this debate. So with that, let's turn to first expert speaker. We will turn to Mathieu Duchâtel of Institut Montaigne, based in Paris. He is the director of the Asia program there, and was based in China, I think, well, the earlier years of this decade, several years when it was still possible for think tanks to be well active there. That's of course also a field that has changed, like the semiconductor industry, which you've been studying in the past year. You published this report, of course, in January of this year that I think many people will have seen about the state of the industry in China. And so your focus will be on China specifically. What is the state of play in China, and what is the course that the country has taken? I think it was back in 2016 that President Xi Jinping said that our dependence on core technology is the biggest hidden trouble for us. What have you seen in between then and now, Mathieu, in terms of what the government has done to decrease or to address this dependence? Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Maaike. I don't know if Xi Jinping had exactly the semiconductor in mind when he said that in 2016, but he proved quite prescient given what happened in the Chinese semiconductor industry in the past 2 years. I'll give a short kind of guidance regarding the current state of the Chinese semiconductor industry, and I make a few short points. I think that the semiconductor industry in China would be a success story by many standards, but not by China's own standards. And in fact, from China's perspective, what we have is rather something that can be described as some sort of underachievement and painful underachievement. But it's a success story as well at the same time. If you look at some of the numbers, for example, China is in the global top 6, despite being a latecomer. It represents about 6% of the global output in value. It has a complete industrial structure covering the whole value chain, from equipment to packaging, and it has champions. It has champions in foundry, SMIC. It had a major champion in IC design, HiSilicon, the IC design branch of Huawei, even though HiSilicon has been hit extremely hard by US tech transfer restrictions. And China is doing a little bit of everything. China doesn't have an ASML, but it has lithography. It has Shanghai microelectronics equipment. It doesn't have Siemens EDA, but it is doing EDA. It has Empyrean software. It has a very strong startup scene, and it has, in fact, a booming supply scene. I read recently that 500,000 companies had registered in the semiconductor sector in 2020, which is an incredible number. China also has a major asset, which is the industrial giants that in fact creates demand for high-end semiconductors, thanks to the large platforms. I'm thinking, for example, of Alibaba and Baidu that are creating IC design branches to support their expansion into cloud and AI, but also hardware companies that are trying to take advantage of Huawei's misfortunes. I'm thinking of Xiaomi, that has been an important investor for the semiconductor industry, and that is clearly aiming, if you look at the statements, at creating a strong IC design branch. And China also has plenty of capital, which is perhaps not sufficient, but that is necessary if you want to catch up with the world's leader, both in IC design and IC manufacturing. There are many examples, and I don't want to get into too many details, but the big fund, which is the National Integrated Circuit Fund, has managed to attract $80 billion in 2 phases since it was created in 2015. China is able to provide very robust tax exemptions for its leading companies in the semiconductor industry. It has the STAR market, the new stock market that supports also the semiconductor industry. Local governments have their own funds. I mean, capital is clearly not the problem. I wanted to say that because the discussion is going to lead us to the question of China's vulnerabilities. And I think it's worth to have in mind that the big picture is a picture of China having developed a strong semiconductor industry. But having said that, I think that the key notion is the notion of vulnerabilities. And indeed, of all industries, the semiconductor industry is perhaps, I think it is, the one for which the government's goals and plans are the further away from the reality of the sector. There's a huge gap. And if you look at the plans, if you look at the policy language, I think the 2 words that really kind of stand out are leadership. Since 2014, it's in 2014 that China has had many plans for its semiconductor industry. But the 2014 plan, for the first time, uses the word leadership as a goal. And recently, under the context, against the context of US tech transfer restrictions, entity list designation, etc., the word that has appeared is self-sufficiency. And to talk of the gap, Made in China 2025 said the targets was 70% of domestic production in China for the semiconductors industry. The reality today is more 15%. And in fact, in volume, China's imports are growing. They grew by 25% in 2020, partly as a result of Huawei, mostly Huawei and other companies creating stocks. But this is the reality. You know, self-sufficiency has been called an unavoidable choice. And this is the policy goal. And in practice, China works hard, if not to reach self-sufficiency, but at least to reduce its dependence on foreign technology. This is clearly a national priority. But the reality is that the US policy, untold policy, but clearly the policy of keeping China 2 to 3 generations behind for the semiconductor industry has been successful so far. And China has a huge problem with no easy solution. I think the key problem for China today is how to continue catching up when other players might be running faster with the industrial policy tools that Ms. Bakker has described, but also in a context that can be described as, you know, previously the value chain was highly interdependent, and all actors were benefiting from interdependence. And this is being replaced by still interdependence, but interdependence with increasingly many conditions and exceptions. And for China, the stakes are very high because from a strategic perspective, using China's own stated goal, China's goal to reach global leadership when it comes to digital transformation, but also the future of the US-China military balance are both at stakes when it comes to the semiconductor industry and the future of the industry. And that's why I want to bring up here the question of the 7 nanometers foundry threshold, because it's very important and crucial for China. There is a policy of preventing China from crossing that threshold and keeping, in particular, SMIC in a state of, impossibility to catch up with the leading foundries, TSMC and Samsung. This looks today that this is really mostly about what can be described as the pure digital. After all, 5 nanometer process foundry is only found in the latest version of your iPhones. But tomorrow, with the diffusion of technology, that generation of technologies will drive digital transformation. I was speaking the other day to someone in the telecom equipment industry who was saying, we don't need it today, but we will need it tomorrow. And this is the same for defense. This is the same for the arms industry. You don't need 5 nanometers to build a ballistic missile guidance system today. You don't know in 30 years, 40 years, to what extent the transformation of the semiconductor industry will create possibilities for innovation in the arms industry. To kind of conclude quickly and kickstart the discussion, I think that China faces 3 major obstacles when it comes to overcoming the current bottlenecks that it is facing. It has, to be honest, a problem of allocation or misallocation of resources under the system of state capitalism. There is an excellent recent example with Wuhan Hongxin, the company in Wuhan that was aiming to create an advanced foundry process at 7 nanometers, etc., and that has in fact burnt billions in capital. There are other examples as well. China also does have a problem of human resources, but a problem of human resources at a very unusual scale. China's own Association for the Semiconductor Industry estimates at 200,000 to 300,000 the number of engineers that the industry needs in China. That's 5 TSMC to give a comparison that is not entirely accurate, but that gives a kind of sense of how the scale of the problem. But the worst problem is, in fact, China's access to foreign technology. And this problem is actually aggravating. There was a moment of hesitation, and in fact, China was waiting for the change, for a possible change in the approach of the United States with the change of administration. But I think that the early signals that we have received are all going in the direction of a very strong continuity with the approach that aimed at restricting China's access to foreign semiconductor technology. So that will create, this is going to shape the environment for the European semiconductor industry in coming years, certainly.
Thanks a lot, Mathieu, for explaining all that in so much detail, where China stands. And indeed, summing up, the policy of keeping China behind has been successful. I think that will be surprising to some. Whether or not this is the biggest sort of explanatory fact in explaining the gap between the reality, or between the ambitions and the reality that we see now in China on the ground is a question that comes to my mind. Just very briefly, perhaps, do you think that this is a determining factor, or is it just one of many that explains the gap?
You mean the problem of access to foreign technology?
Yes.
I think it's one of the key factors, if not the main determinant. And in fact, when listing the three main problems that China has, if you think in terms of 15 to 20 years, the problem of allocation of resources, China has a system that allows some degree of waste, given the amount of capital that is available to support its sector. So it's not insurmountable. And the training of the next generation of Chinese engineers and experts for the semiconductor industry is also something that over time will find its natural solution, increasingly over time. But the problem of access to foreign technology is actually a very serious bottleneck. And I mentioned the 7 nanometer threshold because it's the most symbolic, or at this stage, the most well-known area of huge problem of access and no easy domestic solution, which in fact creates a question for the rest of the world of how you want to protect those technologies if China, as it has done with other technologies, tries to go around the established set of restrictions and controls and various instruments that are being put in place by states to protect their technologies.
Thanks for elaborating on that. I think that's very important to have clarity about as we move to this discussion later on also of what all of this means for European governments and European private sector. But before getting to this debate, let's turn to John Lee. He is a senior analyst with the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERIX, of course, as we know it, in Berlin, where he coordinates also the work in the research cluster of China's use of digital technologies, and more specifically, he co-leads a joint project between SNV and MERIX on power mapping, I believe you call it, the semiconductor industry value, or the semiconductor value chain. John, I think it would be really valuable if you could reflect on what is the state of play from a European perspective in the United States. And of course, Heleen was already alluding to it just now. Just last week, President Joe Biden, he hosted this virtual summit of around 20 CEOs, including several from the semiconductor industry, and he called for a 15 billion investment in semiconductors. Where we have, amid this global shortage of chips, of course, that we are facing. And I'm curious, what in your view does this tell us about the state of play in the United States and the future course?
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Maaike. I believe that the figure was actually 50 billion US dollars, which is proposed as part of the president's infrastructure investment proposal now battling its way through Congress. So I think it's safe to say that the US government is certainly seized of the importance with a little assistance from its auto sector, which has also been the case, of course, here in Europe, in identifying why this is such a critical issue. What I might do is structure my remarks around briefly a look at where the United States sits overall, including in terms of recently adopted measures in the global semiconductor value chain, then have a look at what this means in a European context. So if we were to characterize the overall position of the United States in the global value chain, I think that you really have to say it's still one of dominance with one very prominent vulnerability, which is, of course, cutting-edge fabrication, which is where the attention has been with the measures, for instance, that have been announced in relation to incentives to attract companies like Samsung and TSMC. In fact, specifically those two, as Matthew has referenced, the only ones which are capable of cutting-edge fabrication to build next generation plants within the United States as part of a reshoring initiative for this aspect of the value chain. But elsewhere, of course, American dominance is still very much pronounced. It perhaps gets most attention in the context of electronic design automation tools, which have been, again, referenced earlier in this presentation, and which, of course, have already been the subject of export control measures via Huawei. But in other areas, such as SMEs, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, American firms like Applied Materials also retain a very dominant position. And intellectual property at various stages up the supply chain, and that includes, of course, the sub-supply chains, including that for ASML, though I will let my colleague Yus van Hees talk to that perhaps, is also something that needs to be borne in mind when we talk about the relative decline of American dominance in this industry. And the figures are still very much telling a story of American companies capturing the vast majority of global revenue and profit in this sector. The issue, of course, now is a geopolitical one, and the potential for China to close the gap in some of these critical capabilities, and the implications that may have for market share and technological leadership. Perhaps if we look briefly at the government measures or the highlights that have been put in place by US administrations over the past few years, the 50 billion proposed for the semiconductor sector has already been mentioned. That's within, of course, the context of a $2.3 trillion infrastructure package. So it's obviously not a large amount of money in that context, but it's certainly very significant. Of course, that's also subject to political battles within the United States at the moment as to how that will be divided up and whether, for example, a certain amount of the funding will be earmarked for particular industries such as the auto sector, which have been very prominent in raising their concerns about the supply of semiconductors for their operations as a result of the situation created by the pandemic and, of course, by their own business choices. I've already mentioned the new plants that TSMC and Samsung have both announced to become operational within the next few years in Arizona and Texas. And of course, it's worth noting as well that Intel, which is perhaps the leading broad-based American company in the ecosystem at this point, has also announced its intention to continue competing in the fabrication space with a so-called IDM 2.0 model, referring to their ability to continue making chips for themselves at the cutting edge. They've doubled down on the strategy, and obviously they presumably are in discussions with US authorities as well as to how this could mitigate US dependencies on South Korea and Taiwan in particular for these capacities. Then it's probably also worth noting as well that the Biden administration some time ago instituted a 100-day supply chain review, which is looking at the semiconductor sector specifically, but also is continuing and expressly citing the Trump administration's executive order, for example, in relation to the ICT supply chain in general, to look at vulnerabilities throughout the US ICT sector, and where these need to be mitigated in relation to foreign dependencies. If we were to turn briefly to export controls, I've already mentioned the measures that were taken in relation to Huawei. If we're talking about semiconductors, then at this stage, it's still very much a question of specific Chinese companies that have been targeted by US export control measures, with other prominent examples being SMIC, also referred to before, and Phytium in the supercomputing space, which was just announced last week, I believe, along with a number of other Chinese companies. That said, there are, of course, some moves in Washington to adopt a more broad-based approach to export controls, targeting the Chinese semiconductor industry with the express goal of precluding its or restricting its advances and ability to close the gap with the technological frontier. And there is a proposal, for example, a draft bill by 2 Republican representatives at the moment, I believe, on foot, which would, if adopted in its current form, require licenses for any export of EDA design tools to be applied at, I believe, sub 14 nanometer process nodes, which is not targeted at a specific Chinese company, but all Chinese industry. Obviously, American industry has different views as to the desirability of such sweeping measures, as opposed to more targeted and more targeted measures that are justified by express articulated national security concerns, rather than a broad objective of slowing Chinese technological catch-up. But I think perhaps to put it in larger political perspective, the Biden administration, you would have to say by this point, is very clearly continuing on the same path as its predecessor, if in a more calibrated way. So President Biden himself has referred to China as the United States' most serious competitor. And if you consider the sum total of the measures that I've just listed, say that the picture is quite clear, that there will be a serious technology competition with China going forwards. And the main point of distinction with the Trump administration will be the extent to which the current US administration is able to bring allies on board. So there, of course, in the European context, it's worth noting that there are ongoing discussions. Obviously, the Commission last year proposed a Trade and Technology Council, for example, to coordinate on these types of issues with the United States. But obviously, there is a larger context in which discussions about export controls and semiconductor-related technologies, for instance, takes place. And there are many areas of divergence between EU or European interests writ large and American interests, which would need to be resolved in order to facilitate a coordinated approach in relation to such an important partner as China. Because, of course, if we turn now to the European viewpoint, the strategic setting, at least at the European Commission's level, is very much one of China as both partner and competitor. And how that one might possibly say contradictory model of relations with China is managed will determine to a great extent the space for coordination in the transatlantic arena.
Thank you so much, John. That's really very helpful, and it's a great bridge, I think, also to our next speaker, if I may. Or did you have a final point that you wanted to make?
I think that some of the other points can be addressed in the question and answer. I would rather give Brigitte the opportunity to speak, and then perhaps I can talk a bit more to some of the specific proposals that have been made in the European context and the considerations around those in the question and answer.
Excellent. Yes, I see several questions already coming in, and I would love to keep some time for that also. Because Brigitte, first over to you then, to what's happening in the EU, in Europe. I think that's you can enlighten us about that. Just to briefly introduce you, you joined, of course, the Clingendael Institute in 2018. Now working under the EU Global Affairs Unit. So that's also your view, I think, in this very topic. So will you reflect for us on what's the state of play here in Europe? Like in the US, of course, we see increasingly more debate about semiconductor industry, to what extent governments should be investing in this. The Digital Compass mentions explicitly also semiconductors, and I trust you will reflect on what's written in there also. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Maaike. I will try to address it all in my 5 minutes during this webinar. To start, I think the need to strengthen the EU's chip design capabilities and the fabless industry is actually nothing new. When you look at the EU's previous steps, it can be at least traced back to 2013. In this year, the EU announced a EU-wide strategy to reverse the declining European share of the world's market and boost innovation. And in support of that strategy, an agreement on the joint undertaking involving electronics, components and systems, and the IPSA instrument were launched in 2014. Maybe a nice to know for the Dutch audience is that Nelly Kroes really pushed for this. And 4 years later, to keep up with digital developments and creating a core digital sovereignty, the European Commission introduced this European Design Alliance Plan. But despite those plans and actions, the EU's global semiconductor market share is now still around 10%, so well below its economic standing. And therefore, 19 European member states agreed to work together to bolster Europe's electronics and embedded systems value chain in December 2020. Especially in the new geopolitical, industrial and technological reality that is redefining the playing field at the moment, this cooperation and synergies between the member states are even more necessary than ever, I feel. And as Heleen already mentioned, the latest EU efforts have been the inclusion of the semiconductor industry in the EU's digital compass. This is a 10-year plan which was published in March 2021 and includes in particular funding for various high-tech initiatives and far-reaching aims to get the semiconductor industry back on its feet. And in these efforts, the Sino-American trade tech war is also playing in the background. You see it also here in this panel, having someone focusing on China, having someone focusing on the US, and the EU basically be in the middle. So in the semiconductor industry, Europe is also caught between Washington and Beijing. But on the one hand, the EU has a strong dependency on US software and chip design. This leaves the European semiconductor industry companies vulnerable for export restrictions, which then limit the EU companies' ability to trade with certain Chinese companies. But on the other hand, you also have the Chinese plans to become self-reliant, self-sufficient, which hinder fair competition and threatens European companies' presence in the world's largest semiconductor market. So all in all, I feel that the EU really needs a multidimensional approach to reach the goals they have set now for themselves, which are indeed quite ambitious. Because building up the EU's chip production will be a difficult task. Manufacturing semiconductors is extremely expensive business. I am sure the business representatives here today will tell you all about it in a minute. And the main success of European companies has been creating machinery used in the process rather than the chips themselves. And for cutting-edge semiconductors, the EU is largely dependent on Taiwan and South Korea, just as the rest of the world. But the investments the EU is willing to make are really a first good step. The reason for the EU intervention is clear. I mean, companies cannot compete with the capital and investments of already established and operating companies in this field by themselves. Especially the fabless companies have huge R&D investments to stay competitive. But it's also not just about the money in this industry. If it was just about the money, China would already be even more successful. Even though, as Mathieu mentioned, it is already quite remarkable how far they have come in such little time. So maybe to close, therefore the EU needs to determine in what areas it is still an indispensable partner to protect its own technological choke points. The European Union should support Europe's world-leading equipment manufacturers such as ASML, TRUMPF or ZEISS. And secondly, the EU needs to focus on encouraging semiconductor companies to partner with non-EU technological partners. Working together could shorten technology development timelines and ensure better access to R&D resources. And I feel in the whole debate about digital sovereignty and breaking up the supply chain, working together is really undervalued. And it wouldn't be realistic to assume that the EU players can innovate and create that cutting edge technology that is desired now from them without those partnerships. The lack of partnerships could even leave EU players even further behind, despite all the promised investments. And also the R&D gains of these partnerships are interesting. Partnering up would also mean quick access to a top level talent pool in this domain. And that said, I feel the EU should also not lose vision on the actual demand and the markets European-based companies address. In the political debate, it has been a lot on cutting edge and 2 nanometer nodes, which is really fancy to talking about, but reducing dependency could also mean increasing capacities down to 12 nanometer technology nodes instead of focusing on those cutting edge 5, 3 or 2 nanometer technology nodes. So how are you going to work together? Looking into the future, the EU seems already mull the possibility of building an advanced semiconductor factory in Europe. Convincing TSMC or Samsung through financial incentives to build a fab in the EU would be a first idea. A second one could be setting up an EU foundry, but this will be a hard and long road. And I think it may not be the most opportune for the EU. So honestly, there has not been a leading edge fab operational in Europe for over 2 decades. So only if you include all the stakeholders, both public, private, to come together, pool the resources, it may be possible. Or, and this is really to close it off, when you have a chip company's customers that force companies to build a fab close to them, then it may work. You see this already now with Apple, that is leaning heavily towards TSMC to really put in some local productions in the US. So yeah, I will stop here. Thank you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the debate.
Thanks a lot, Brigitte. With some very practical suggestions also how to take this forward. And I think also some thinking on the trusted communities that Heleen Bakker just mentioned, how to go about those, who should be included. I think those are questions that are really now on the table within governments. So thanks for your input on that. I'm very curious also to hear from our practitioners, perhaps reflecting on some of the suggestions that Brigitte already gave. So let's turn to them now. First of all, I'd like to give the floor to Anna-Lena Riem. She is a public policy officer or expert at Infineon Technologies AG, where you work, Anna. Thanks for, we can now see you, where you work, of course, on security and technology policy with a focus on China and the US. How could it not be China and the US, many would say, because, of course, your company, Infineon, is globally operating, a leading semiconductor player, so heavily affected, I think, by what is happening both in the United States and in China. So a question to you, of course, is, well, in this semiconductor industry, where we see it's operating in an increasingly geopolitical environment, how do those tensions between the United States and China affect you, the semiconductor industry at large, and perhaps your company specifically? Thanks for being with us today.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I think all of my previous speakers have described the situation that we face in all 3 regions pretty well. As a company, we are very concerned with regard to the international fragmentation that we see, because we believe that we face a lot of global challenges like climate change, for example, or the corona pandemic that needs a common approach, and we have to address these problems together. So as a company, we are committed to the free trade and market economy, and from our perspective, it doesn't make sense to think in blocks, because we are already living in a multiply connected economic world. As you mentioned, the dispute between China and the US is affecting the semiconductor industry in a special way. And as a company that is active in all 3 regions, we have to comply with the respective legal requirements that we face. So therefore, we have to take all regulations that are new and maybe more stricter than in the past into account and act accordingly to that. So we are under current evaluation of new regulations and how to deal with that in the future.
Yes, I imagine that the legal experts, the number of them at your company has been growing.
Quite busy.
Yes, and getting more busy, of course. So how do you envision the future of your industry and again, your company specifically? It won't be getting any easier, I suppose. So you must be, well, thinking ahead?
Right. As I said, our industry is a global one, and we like to keep it like that. But as you said, we can't close our eyes either. So we don't expect that the tensions between the US and China will disappear in the near future. And instead, we see a stronger focus on regionalization and localization, while the overall demand for semiconductors is increasing. And Europe has to react to these developments accordingly. So the semiconductor industry is of fundamental importance for the EU and its political goals. So new technologies provide solutions for mobility needs, intelligent manufacturing, smart cities, operation of critical infrastructures, and the global climate protection, of course. So microelectronics are a key enabler for Europe's prosperity, also for the future, and they provide the solutions we need to face these challenges. So without a strong and competitive European microelectronics ecosystem, all the ambitious targets that the EU has, for example, the Green Deal or the digital transformation, cannot be achieved. And therefore, I agree with what Bridget said about the multi-dimensional approach that we need. We should preserve the technical choke points that we have. We should strengthen our technology segments where European-based companies are already market leaders, which is, for example, power electronics, embedded security solutions, and sensors, and we should expand the manufacturing capacities in Europe. And to make that clear, Mathieu already also mentioned it, this magic threshold of 5 to 7 nanometers is a good goal, but it's more of a future goal. And we have to take the steps today that are necessary to lead us there. So you can't stop at a manufacturing node of 90 nanometers and then leapfrog your way to 5 to 7 nanometers. You have to go all those steps down because you need the knowledge behind the processes, you need the expertise. And this is why we have to start with regard to manufacturing where we are right now. And also when you take the current chip shortage into account, it's not leading edge what is missing right now. We see a structural challenge with regard to 40 nanometers because we have a lot of technologies like for example, microcontrollers or camera chips, display drivers, IoT applications, sensors that cannot be scaled down further in the direction of smaller technology nodes. So all these applications occupy the largest part of the available manufacturing capacities at the 40 nanometer range. So this is a structural challenge that we also face, and this is something that led to the current chip shortage, also with regard to the automotive sector. So this is something that we need to take into account when talking about extending manufacturing capacities in Europe. And then, of course, we need a suitable instrument to channel political support, resources, and expertise. And all of these instruments available in Europe, the important projects of common European interest, is a good instrument because it has the strongest immediate impact to combine significant investments from the private and the public sector in R&D and first industrial employment. So the IPCI can really help us to channel the investments we need to strengthen the microelectronics ecosystem in the EU, investing significantly in wafer manufacturing, in equipment manufacturing, IP design generation, and software, for example.
Okay, so I hear both a very realistic, practical sort of take, and at the same time this ambition and the positives of government proposals. Or action, actually. If there's just one thing that you could ask of governments to now do, what would it be? What do you think is what the industry really needs right now?
I think Europe really needs a clear roadmap for the next 10 to 15 years, and one that has to be measured against the actual requirements and therefore adjusted when necessary. And this roadmap has to line out a bunch of measures and initiatives that we need to address the needs of the industry. And to achieve this, microelectronics need to be permanently implemented in policy planning. So a healthy and competitive ecosystem is key to ensure economic prosperity, but also key to addressing the challenges we face in Europe. And therefore, the current interest in semiconductors is good, but it should not be a short-term phenomenon due to conflict or current political coalitions. It should be an integral part of policy planning, not only for now, but for the coming decades.
So do you feel that you have the right number or the right people that you can engage with within governments on these issues? Have governments made the investments?
I mean, at the moment, everybody wants to talk about the topic. So we have the feeling that a lot is in motion, and governments start to recognize how important the industry is at large. But I think this needs to be something that is implemented, and that is there when the next government takes over, for example, that it is nothing that you can discuss over and over again and that changes with the next coalition. I mean, despite the whole conflict, if we put US-China conflict aside, the semiconductor industry, the whole microelectronics industry would still be important because it's so fundamental to the green transition, to the digital transformation. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Thank you. Yes,
thank you.
That's the bigger picture, of course, also. Perhaps we get to you again, of course, in Q&A, but first now I would like to move on to our final speaker, Joost van Hees. You are now head, of course, of global government affairs at ASML, which is, of course, the Dutch multinational that is a worldwide supplier of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And you serve, of course, the major chip makers throughout the world with your hardware, software, and services. So also to you, Joost, the question, how does the US-China tech conflict impact your company's business and the semiconductor industry at large?
Thanks, Maaike. Well, and thanks for having me. Well, I'll get to your question. I briefly wanted to respond to a few things I've heard as well at the same time while doing that. So indeed, we make equipment, we don't make chips. I want to make that very clear. I think most people know by now. We started 37 years ago, and our first customer back then was a US customer, right? That's where it started. If you look at our China business, that started about 25 plus years ago, and that has grown to a staggering number of 20% of our global revenues in 2020. So you may have read in the press about an EUV system that cannot be shipped to China, which is part of a license application that's currently ongoing. But we do quite a bit of business, have quite some history with doing business in China. Okay, that's one. And I heard some people mention, what I miss in the discussion so far, to be frank, is a bit of understanding for the Chinese position. And also for the US position, by the way, and I'll get to that. But if you look at the global electronics ecosystem, a lot of money goes on in that ecosystem globally, and that's an ecosystem electronics from equipment on the one side, and we're part of that, all the way down to software and services. This is predominantly dominated by the US, right? So out of the 400 plus billion US dollars that are going around in operational profits in this ecosystem, it's approximately 3/4 of this that is going to US business, which is an enormous innovation powerhouse, so to say, right? Sometimes people tend to forget that in the discussions that we have in this context, and I wanted to emphasize that. I also want to emphasize, and that's based on a remark that you made, Brigitte, only 10% of global supply in Europe, and that's below our standard, you say. Well, if you look at the demand in China, chips are the #1 import product. Last year, it's almost 380 billion US dollars in imports. If you look at what they produce themselves, it's limited to a couple of percent, below 10, right? So that's a bit hard to understand. So you can understand their ambition to become more self-sufficient, right? I think I want to emphasize that. So on the one hand, you have the US, who has a dominant position in the ecosystem. On the other hand, you have China, who's a very big player in the ecosystem and want to step up its self-sufficiency because right now they're importing more chips than oil. Understood. One of the things that's important for us as ASML is that let's please not raise more fences, right? So that relates to the protect agenda of governments. So we're not in favor of more fences. We're in favor of let's continue to out-innovate our competition. So if you talk about false competition, if you talk about state aid, well, we're doing it now as well, and we're applauding it in the EU. We're applauding it in the US. And I think it's a good thing. That's okay. But you know, we're not afraid of another competition that may pop up in another region, for example, in China. Let's make sure that we continue to out-innovate our competition, and for that we need our global revenue. So if I tell you that 20% of our revenue last year was Chinese, that's 20% out of 14 billion, which is 2 billion for our company. If we invest 15 to 20% of that amount in R&D to maintain our technology leadership position, it's quite substantial, particularly if you translate that to the coming years. So this global open market is extremely important. Yeah, but again, we see quite a bit of developments ongoing as we speak, illustrating a move towards a more decoupled industry, where, like Anna-Lena said, like Infineon, we're not in favor of that. So we're very much in favor of a globally integrated ecosystem. But things are changing, so let's be clear about that. Well, I am concerned about personally, but also we as a company, about the backfiring of export controls, right? So what we see is that China is stepping up its own development. What we see is that they're doing that also in the field of lithography. 5 years ago, we looked at what they were doing in the field of EUV lithography, our most advanced lithography, and we know they were working on all the right things. For us, there's no reason not to ship. As a matter of fact, let's ship and make them pay for our innovation here back home in Europe, right? And that applies to other customers throughout the world as well. But they're stepping up their development programs. And if you look at SMEE, that's a equipment company in Shanghai, they actually announced that they're going to introduce a deep UV immersion lithography system this year or at the beginning of next year, right? So they're starting to do it. And then, yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. We need the market. We need to stay ahead. So please allow us to have that revenue in this important market for us. And an additional concern is in the US. And again, I'm talking about protective measures, the protect agenda of the governments. There's very much a lithography focus. If you look at EUV, so again, our most advanced lithography technology, we understand that is considered a choke point, and at this moment, it's controlled on the Wassenaar. So that's what it is, and we understand it. But what we do not understand is the focus that we see now and in other parts of the world on litho and deep UV immersion lithography, because in fact, this is old technology introduced in 2007. Not much has changed since. The only reason that more advanced chips can be made, the most advanced chips can be made using old lithography is via technologies that are actually provided not from Europe, but from other parts of the world. And these are other process steps in order to make chips. And Anna-Lena can tell you more about that. But it's not about deep UV lithography, that's a choke point technology in that context, but the fingers of certain parts in the world are very much focusing on litho, and that means they're focusing on Europe and the Netherlands. And you can question whether that's a good thing, right? So we would say not. And if we're allies, let's make sure that the burden in this context is fairly shared among the various regions. And then finally, on the promote side, and I think I did address your question one way or the other, but strengthening the European and then Dutch industry is a good thing. We're very much in favor of the EPK instrument. It's a good initiative, and we're, like Anna-Lena said, let's focus on European strength. So what are we good at? Now, Anna-Lena mentioned a few in her segment. If you look at our position, it's focusing on equipment, and that's not only ASML, it's also ASMI, it's also BESI, different companies, but definitely also something to mention is advanced process technology development in IMEC in Leuven, right? This is really a European strength. Put money on that, on these kinds of nuggets where you're really good at, strengthen those nuggets and make sure you create dependencies on the outside world on EU technology. And yeah, I think that's my story for now. Did that answer your question, Maaike, or not really?
You already answered also the questions that I was going to ask. Of what would be your key wish of what governments do? I think you made that very clear.
One thing I would like to add to that, if I may, and that's looking at the industrial interests. Because if I look at some other parts of the world, some other countries, they're better at that. For example, Japan, that you know pretty well, I think, Maaike, is also a country that has been pretty efficient and good in their industry policy. And let's not forget the self-interest of countries also in the context of protect. So sometimes you see export control measures being proposed, which are not beneficial to European industry and may be beneficial to the respective proposer, if you see what I'm saying. I think it's important for European policymakers to really get a good insight in what the interests of industry are, and also to get good insights on what the interests of the industry, of the counterparts on the other side of the table are.
Thank you. That's very clear. The question is, of course, whether the industry, the interests of industry are also the interests of society at large, which is also what governments are looking at.
Keep in mind. That's a correct statement.
Picture. I think that's also the challenge that at least governments are dealing with. Perhaps Heleen would like to reflect on that later. Thank you so much. 7 excellent introductions, and relatively little time for our questions. But I trust that you all have also been looking in the chat to see, look at the questions that came in. An early question that came in was on China's tech issues. Are they a threat or a business collaboration? Does the EU do that? Do we take, as the EU, China's high-tech issues as a threat or as a business collaboration? Perhaps that's a question that each of our speakers, the experts, could address. And also perhaps Heleen, I think it was clear where our private sector representatives stand. They see this, the Chinese investments as a reason for us to invest even more, to run harder, rather than trip the other guy. As I heard once an American put it. How about the Dutch government? How about perhaps the views from France and Germany? You're still muted, Heleen. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding me. No, thanks for that question, and also thanks to the other panelists for providing such interesting and rich insights. I carefully listened and also was writing along. Of course, we try to take along the insights of industry when it comes to policy setting, right? But as you also pointed out, it will always be part of a broader consideration. Also, well, I've already talked about economic security, safeguarding public interests, and in that sense, the toolbox has developed over time. And in response to the question on whether it's a business opportunity or whether we look at it from another perspective, I think it's fair to say that the Dutch government and the Ministry of Economic Affairs in particular have also shifted their point of view over the past years. I mean, we are increasingly aware and with an increased frequency also of risks and threats that are coming our way and that we need to confront. So in that sense, I should say, and I repeat, the Netherlands has always been internationally oriented, strong emphasis on an open economy. I can totally relate to what Annalena and Joost were saying about how you don't want to view the world in blocks, how it's better to have an open trade and investment system, etc. But circumstances have forced us to shift that gears in that respect, and to also develop a little bit more our toolbox. And this is just, it doesn't relate to semiconductor industry only. It's of course a broader issue. But as the semiconductor and microprocessors are so at the start of most of the key strategic value change, and also big part of the digital transformation that we're trying to achieve, I think it's fair to say from a government perspective that, yeah, we do feel the need to react and respond. And sometimes that might be not to the liking of the industries, which we can also imagine from their point of view. And then in that sense, I think you will see that, of course, we look to our allies, to countries that share democratic values, that share the same sort of rule-based rule of law approach, and that China, although we make that distinction, of course, China as a partner, China as a competitor, China as a strategic or systemic rival, that China in that sense is not always highest on the list. So maybe let me leave it at that.
Thanks, Heleen. That was useful. Of course, the question I think can be related to two other questions that were in the chat box, whether or not Chinese hacking and spying will intensify. So, you know, are the threats, is China trying to innovate itself out of here in ways that are illegal? And should we be addressing mainly that, or should we be indeed focusing on instruments such as IPK, so innovate ourselves out of this? Those were two other questions that were addressed. What I would like to do with a view to the time, I realize that we have only 5 minutes left, give every of the 5 other speakers the opportunity to have their final 1-minute pitch, have a look at the other questions that I could not even mention out loud, and pick and choose from which what you would like to answer. Let's go in the same order as we did just now. So starting with Mathieu.
Thanks, Maaike. It's difficult, and I just discovered the questions in the chat box, so I should have made better use of my time, but it was great to listen very carefully to what was being said by all co-panelists. You know, I think that a dichotomy applies to our interactions as Europe with China in the semiconductor industry. For example, I think that the automotive industry will remain a very strong driver of deeper business ties and integration between the Chinese and the European industries. Because this is an industry that will be much less politicized and securitized than the pure digital. And I'm not even starting to talk about the possible military end uses or the possible use of semiconductor industry by companies that are involved in human rights violations, because this is where the discussion on the protect side is going right now. What I think, and I can only make this very short conclusion, for the EU, you know, we are talking both protect and promote. The two elements are very important. There are the two legs. I just want to argue that I think that on the protect side, our toolbox of defensive measures is progressing, but is not complete yet. And in fact, there was a very interesting recent case that involves Italy, and I believe also partly involved the Netherlands, with the acquisition of 70% of an epitaxy company based in northern Italy called LPE, which was blocked by the Italian government. This was a Chinese acquisition. This is one of the first cases that makes it, you know, in the media, in open source material, regarding intra-European cooperation on a case of, you know, Chinese investment in a semiconductor company in Europe that is being considered by the Italian government. I mean, we don't know how the process really worked in practice, but what we know is that the European Commission was able to give its opinion, that the company's counterparts in Sweden and in the Netherlands were also involved in sharing you know, information and views regarding that particular acquisition that was blocked. You know, this is investment screening in practice, and I think that there will be more and more cases as the process of investment screening starts being implemented in Europe. This has been only 6 months, and that's only one part of the defensive toolbox. I think export control are still in discussion to some degree for some specific licensing, but also for the updating of control lists as a larger topic. So this is an issue that is moving. And there is the issue also of cooperation through research and education that we feel, you know, is also making it as a policy question for the Europeans regarding the balance we want to strike between openness and protecting certain areas.
Thanks, Mathieu. That's very valuable to indeed unpack the defensive toolkit and to highlight what has been achieved and what should be done more. John, what would be your 1-minute pitch? to close off.
Thanks, Maaike. Just quickly, I think the broad parameters of the debate are understood by now. They've been well canvassed today. If I had to highlight one thing, and this goes to what Joost was saying, I think that I would like to see a clearer strategic case made for some of the defensive measures that are being proposed. So I've already referred to I think Tom Cotton-sponsored bill in Washington at the moment, for instance, which, from my recollection, doesn't really provide a reason for why restricting the Chinese industry at sub-14 nanometer nodes is necessary. And you can say the same, I think, for some of the recent commentary that has come out on the subject, quite a lot of it actually, even, for example, the report from the National Commission on Artificial Intelligence that also came out in Washington, DC earlier this year, I believe nominated a similar process node for measures to restrict Chinese industry without a clear justification for why this was necessary. Now, obviously, there's a general context of the political relationship with China and of Chinese industrial policy ambitions. I think that's all well understood by now, and it's not in some ways very productive to keep on revisiting it. Where the discussion needs to move is to how do we define national interest and calibrate the actual measures that are being proposed according to that. So again, if you want to use the metaphor of the small yard, high fence, like how do you define the area of the yard and the height of the fence? Like everyone understands the concept by this point, but I certainly get the feedback from industry, and I think that our two colleagues today have conveyed that, that they see a disconnect between what is being proposed, or at least thrown around in the public discussion, and the blowback to them, which of course goes to national interest, because the ability of Western industry to stay competitive is exactly what we should be concerned with here, as well as to the specific risk profile coming or attached to the Chinese side, which I don't think is always well articulated.
Thanks a lot, John. So the need for a clear strategic case for why we are taking certain defensive tools. Very clear points. Brigitte, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I think for my 1-minute pitch, I want to highlight that export control, as we have talked about, but also investment screening and knowledge transfer to universities and companies, which is also requested in the chat, is basically 3 pillars of defensive measures, and you have to have them all in order, and you cannot separate them from each other, because if you lack on one, they will come in that pillar or another pillar. But if you have those 3 in order and you know what you're doing there, you can maintain that open competitive economy, which this business is thriving on, and what we need to promote in the Netherlands. And then just shortly on another question, I do feel that coming legislation should be a combination of experts in the technology sector and the government experts to really create a holistic approach, both parallel within the member states, but also already in the European Union. So to not stick too much into the national debates while the world is moving forward, and while the European debate is also moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a 2-level game, of course, that all EU member states are playing. So work harder on the EU level and be, well, dare to act there even earlier than later. Anna.
Yeah, I would add to the discussion the need for a deeper technical understanding of the industry. The 5 nanometer debate is a perfect example. Like when it's opposed, I sometimes have the feeling that politicians think you just place a 5 nanometer fab somewhere in Europe and all of our problems will be solved. And this is just not the case. So understanding is needed for the processes of our industries. How long does it take to manufacture a chip? How long does it take to get the equipment? What expertise is needed? What skills are needed? What can we do to build all of this in Europe? And I think when asking these questions, you really get to a point where you say, okay, I also have to fund education. I have to fund universities, research institutes, all of that to be competitive in the future. And I would like to see that we have a deeper understanding for the industries, for the processes at place, and for all the interconnectedness that falls into place with regard to this discussion.
Thank you so much. It almost sounds like a need for a rethink of our type of capitalism, where public and private has been separated, perhaps a little bit to a too large extent. That's for a later discussion. Joost, over to you for the final word.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with the what Anna-Lena said also just now, to create a deeper understanding of technology. I think it's very important for governments. I have to say that with the Dutch government in our dialogue, that goes pretty well. So I'm happy with that. But we need to continue that also in different countries. A few words: protect and promote. We understand national security concerns, by the way, and that need to be addressed by governments. But like I said before, instead of building walls via export controls, we prefer to run faster, and therefore the promote agenda is most important for us. So please strengthen European strengths, the European nuggets that I was mentioning, the technology nuggets. And if you decide to collaborate internationally, then I think it's very important to be able to trust each other, which is key. And trust implies putting sometimes your self-interest aside. Right, so and that's something that's very important. So promoting for us at this point in time is particularly focusing on how can we strengthen the European sector, particularly. Thank you.
Thank you, Joost. And a positive agenda then to end with. To end this seminar with, of course, I'm very happy that most of our participants are still with us. I feel like a terrible host because I've let you go over time, but I think, well, we could have gone on for another hour or another day. But I thank you all for being with us, for being concise, and I look forward to continue the debates at the next occasion.
Thank you.
Bye to you all.